This is a video that's designed to go with a cabinet display that's on at Melbourne University at the moment in the Arts West building on level 5, about the work of Alexander Buchan, who was the lesser known colleague of Sydney Parkinson on Captain Cook's Endeavour voyage. He died very early in the voyage in 1769 in Tahiti. Very little is known of Buchan's life, and so what we have to do is, because we don't have the documents like his birth certificate and all those kinds of standard documents that you normally construct a history from, we only had his works. We're having to construct a biography from him, from his artistic practice. We met back in around 2000 when we were artists at the Gertrude Street Galleries, which is an artist-run collective.
Yeah, in Fitzroy in Melbourne.
And so it gave you the chance to really develop your work over an extended period of time. And then the other really important thing was that was where you developed your peer group. Art history tends to emphasise the influence of the famous artists, and of course they're very important, the international ones. But really, I think that your peer group, the artists that you're talking with day to day, are really what shapes your practice over the long term. I wrote my PhD on the artists on Captain Cook's Endeavour voyage. And when I started looking at these drawings, the way that I immediately approached it was through the constraints that were imposed by the artists by their conditions. So things were obviously much more extreme than we had in the studios, but they're basically the same: the space, the time available to you, your materials, and your peer group. And so it was about identifying those. What are the parameters of artistic practice on the Endeavour? And this is what intellectual historians like Quentin Skinner and J.G.A. Pocock would call the rules of the game. So as an artist, you're working within certain parameters that become the constraints on your work, and that's what actually becomes recognisable as your style. And so when I started looking at the Endeavour drawings, what became clear very quickly was that there was far too much work for Sydney Parkinson to have, or he signed far more drawings than he actually did himself, which isn't unusual in the 18th century. But the thing was that he was signing drawings that were much worse than he was capable of doing, which were, in some cases, obviously works by children, and the youngest midshipman on the Endeavour was 12 years old, and others that were much better than him. And some of those were by his colleague Alexander Buchan. And as part of my thesis, I was very lucky. I went on an exchange to Edinburgh for 12 months, and I saw Buchan's original zoological drawings, which are unpublished in the Natural History Museum, and they are really exquisite. And they bear no relation to the drawings that are signed by him, works like View of the Endeavour's Watering Place in the Bay of Good Success, which I think is actually a work by one of the young midshipmen. So this project really kind of took that idea of practice-led research to the next level of bringing creative practice to the investigation of the work of a historical artist.
Yeah, I mean, I often, in the absence of having a peer group, actually construct one for myself. So I'll invent institutions or artists or any kind of hierarchical structure that I can kind of insert myself into, and often work under pseudonym as a practicing artist who has different capacities to the capacities that I have,
and you create the documentation.
Yeah, create the documentation that proves that this actually happened. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's simply a reconstruction of something that I'd like to happen. So this project made sense to me in terms of with very little information, trying to establish who made what on the Endeavour, how long it may have taken them to make those works, what materials may have been likely to have been used. That required some historical research.
What are the problems they are having to overcome?
Yeah, and the impact of the conditions, like working inside a cramped cabin, the intense humidity on that part of the voyage, movement of the ship. The Endeavour was, it was a pretty unstable vessel. So all of these factors put into play to establish
who he is.
Yeah. Yeah, and how that hierarchy worked in a way that
Yes.
we have, I think, trouble understanding today.
Yeah, because there's not just the physical constraints that determine an artist's practice, but also the kind of conceptual constraints as well. And one of those is clearly the idea of the artist's signature, which for us says this is the artist who made this work, and that's absolutely key to art history. It's key because it's essential to the commercial value of the work of art. If you can show that the artist signed this work but they didn't actually make it, it affects the value. In the 18th century, not so important, certainly not so important in a scientific expedition.
No.
Where these artists aren't creating what we would define in those terms as works of art. And so what they're operating on is a really different kind of concept of the creative entity, where I was saying to you, it's much more like the family. We have this in modern marriage, even today, where you have the great man and you'll have the wife who's supporting him, and the work that her kind of support is kind of subsumed within his identity. And this kind of applies not just to women in the 18th century, but to the kind of whole household and to your servants. And it's important to remember that servants is just a word for an employee. So anyone who's an employee is a servant. And Banks had 4 servants on this ship, and they are not domestic helps, but highly trained, field assistants. So in the case of the artists, the idea of working under the name of another artist is you're simply contributing to the work as a whole, and it actually creates a sense of belonging to the entity of the household, the family, rather than something where you're you're kind of having a loss of identity from that. And in some ways, you're taking on the identity of this, and in this case, very famous voyage.
It's difficult for us in a contemporary sense to understand in terms of autonomous kind of play, the kind of autonomous play as artists that we engage in today. It didn't happen that way on board.
Well, because so much of your for us today, your financial security depends on you having that identification that this is my work, this is my saleable commodity. Whereas in the 18th century, your security depends on you belonging to that estate of Joseph Banks as a servant. That is your lifelong employment. In the case of James Roberts, he was born on Banks' estate, the Revesby estate, and he died there. He retired on the estate. So he spent his entire life in Banks' employ. So what we ended up doing for this project was really taking that approach of trying to understand Buchan by reproducing his conditions and his practices.
Yeah, so one of the first things that I did was actually try to make a copy of Buchan's drawing Oniscus chelops, which is a very microscopic watercolour of a tiny little sea organism. Beautiful work.
Little shrimp, yes. But
Yeah. And really, understanding, I mean, A, the materials that he used, and B, the time it took for him to do it. But also, as I worked through the painting, I noticed that there were some ink corrections that had been made over the top of that drawing, and you think potentially by Banks.
Yeah, that was quite a common thing for naturalists to do in the 18th century. And this goes back to that idea of the relationship between the artist and the patron. So Banks... the idea is that you develop this relationship that develops over years. So you can have someone for decades. So you're training them up scientifically. And so Buchan has produced this really exquisite little watercolour, and then Banks has drawn over it, I think, the legs or something like that, which is like a correction.
And then after, while I was working on those works, I was thinking about the sorts of conditions that the artists on board the Endeavour would have experienced. And how best to replicate those to understand the impact of that environment on their work. And so I had this notion of building a reconstruction of the cabin that he worked in.
Yeah, because the constraints on space were one of the most important constraints, because it's not just about how much room you have, but also it affects surface space and it affects physical movement.
So I looked into getting the original plans for the Endeavour. We got some images. We got walkthroughs of the replica of the Endeavour that's been made, And from all those sources, tried to construct a life-size box in my backyard, and create kind of a miniature studio space for myself in the backyard, and use it as a space to sort of test out some of the theories that we had about what was possible in those conditions.
So here we are inside the cabin, and even though it's pretty tiny, it's actually surprisingly comfortable. I think once you're set up at your desk, it's actually not too bad.
No, I've been working at this desk a little bit, and I've found it to be a pretty easy space to work in. It does suit me as a right-hander, because we've got a light source from this hatch and a light source from the door here. And then while I'm sitting at the desk here, working away, I've got the light coming in over my left-hand shoulder and not creating any annoying shadows on the work as I'm making it. So that's pretty useful for me as a right-hander, hard if you're a left-hander.
And you've also put in this candle holder.
I have, I've put in the candle holder. You know, the whale oil lamps that were actually in here originally on board the Endeavour only emitted about 1 to 2 candle strength worth of light, so not a whole heap of light. So at night it would have been a pretty useless space to work in. But if you had to do it, you know, you'd have to.
Banks does talk about using candles, but the problem was that when they had the windows open, it would blow the candles out. So,
that is a shame. So what do you have? Do you sacrifice airflow for light, or what do you do in that kind of situation?
So it only becomes really cramped when you try to stand up.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's see what it's like.
So it's not just to do with the height, which is about 4'8" or something. But it's also to do with if you're moving around, all you have to get actually under the beams. So.
It does take a bit of sort of spatial awareness, doesn't it, to kind of move around and not bash your head against these, which would have been very heavy oak beams. So most of the light on board here through into the cabin would have been coming through from the officer's mess, from what's called the afterfall area. So a lot of ambient light spill through the doorway here and into the cabin space, plus the little hatch on the other side there. But in addition to that, there was also an exterior hatch. So on the actual side of the boat here, there was a flap that could be opened fully, and light would pass through there. But also, because the hatch was so close to the waterline, you'd often have water spraying in, and apparently occasionally the odd flying fish would actually enter the space as well, which would have been a little bit exciting.
So when you're talking about the question of space, how much space was available, there's the idea of the actual dimensions of the room, but there's also how big are you inside that space, and a question that's often brought up is were people smaller in the 18th century? And an expert on that question is Professor Hamish Maxwell Stewart, who is a maritime historian at the University of New England.
Well, of course, height varies quite significantly. But the convicts transported to Australia, for example, were 5'4", so short compared to contemporary populations. And we have a lot of evidence that they were not, however, particularly tall compared to working class Britons. So in the 18th and early 19th century, stature was considerably shorter than it was today. But we can also use the occupational information gathered from soldiers and convicts in order to explore differences in height by, across the place that you're born and the occupation that you report. And one of the things that's really quite striking is that sailors tend to be shorter than others. So I think that there is some occupational selection that goes on as people grow up and choose careers. And in the 18th century, if you were going to spend a life at sea, it paid to be short.
Yes, well, of course, Nelson was tiny, but on the other hand, Cook was over 6 foot, I think, and I've read somewhere that Banks was as well.
So height is a reflection of two things. It's the genes that you inherit from your parents, and also the environmental circumstances that you experienced in utero and up to, well, now we think probably you're quite late teens, because there is the potential for catch-up growth.
Yes.
Quite later on in the growing process. But up to 20% of height can be a reflection of your early childhood circumstances. And of course, we would expect those that became officers to have lived better early adult lives than those who became below deck seamen. And yep, so that there was a marked difference. I mean, if somebody was tall in the past, it was likely that they had a better upbringing, or indeed that they came from Scotland or Ireland. So rural populations were taller than urban, and those that came from Gaelic-speaking parts of Britain tended to be taller still, largely because of the quality of the diet that they got.
They take up less space as well. I guess that's a benefit in terms of volume of crew on ship.
Well, of course, that's the other aspect as well. When you look at how tiny these vessels were and how many people that there were on board. And of course, a lot of people are sharing space as well, because that's how the watch system works. That you have a series of watches. So everybody's moving around about a very, very tall, small amount of space that's pitching around at sea. And it's an environment which suits shorter people, even though some of the officers are taller.
I don't know if this is a kind of an area that you could speak to, Hamish, about. I mean, there are references in the journals to the amount of mopping that had to be done throughout the ship on a daily basis to keep mold growth down, but still mold found its way through, all paper surfaces and even vertical surfaces in the on board. And I imagine, if you're an artist working on paper, watercolor on paper, painting specimens, that'd be a considerable impediment. Do you have any insight into that kind of area?
Sure, well, all of that is true. So ships are very damp environments. The bottom of the ship is permanently damp. So the bilge, so the spaces right at the bottom of the vessel tend to collect foul water, and so they stink. Now, this would have been of concern to people on board other than the artists. In the 18th century, the predominant theory of disease transmission was miasma theory. So if it smelt bad, it was bad. So it was bad smells. And of course, this is in a sense not crazy, because things that do smell bad tend to actually produce bacteria. And so as a result, cleanliness on board was taken very seriously on all vessels. And keeping dampness down was a particular issue. So it was quite common, for example, not to swab decks. I mean, some captains did swab, others didn't. Where they didn't swab, what they did was that they dry scrubbed decks with bits of pumice, so that they would try and scrape the dirt off them, but keep them dry. But when vessels did get wet, they tried to air them out through a combination of driving air through them. And quite often this was done with sailcloth to create funnels which caught the wind and drove it down below decks. But also quite often with lamps, so the things that burnt stuff inside the vessel in order to heat it up and drive out the fetid matter. So this would have would have been a practical concern. There would have been mold, and people would have been very worried about it.
We just wanted to talk about one of the paintings that was made on the ship, because I think it will make quite a good example of the processes that the artists had to go through. This was a painting of a shark that was captured as they were leaving Madeira, so right at the beginning of the voyage, on the 29th of September. And the shark was 5 feet 4 inches long. So it's a big animal. I'll share my screen so you can see the painting. Yep. So what we're thinking about is the documentation process for this. So what happened with the shark was captured at 12 o'clock, and then it had to be sketched and then painted, and Banks and Solander had to do their description of it, so they had to write down their notes, but it was also dissected, and you can see its eyes there. And then once they'd finished, they ate it for lunch or ate it for dinner at 4 o'clock. And what was normally happen is, or could happen as well with a specimen, is that could be the servants had to preserve it, so there's a preservation process as well. So we know that Banks had a platform built on over the quarterdeck, I think it was. It's basically over the rudder. And it looks very precarious. But I think they must have done a lot of documentation up there, because I can't see. Well, it's not just these large animals. I mean, this one, the idea of taking this down into the Great Cabin is, first of all, I think the only way to get it down there would be to go virtually down a ladder with it. And then once you're down at that lower deck level, then to get to the Great Cabin, you virtually have to bend over double to get it there. So we're thinking, even with something like the jellyfish that they were capturing that they put in these glass jars, moving those specimens around would just be impossible. So they must have been working on the deck.
Yes, look, I've got no doubt that when they could, people wanted to be on deck rather than being cooped up below. This is just more space. This is just reinforces everything that you were saying earlier. And remarkable illustrations like this are at least the first sketches would have been done on deck. There's no way that that was going to be taken below decks. But also, I don't think even if they had taken it below decks, you would have had enough light. I think the other thing that is kind of interesting here is to imagine this not going on in isolation, but going on in conjunction with the routine of the ship. I mean, ships have been called the first factories, in that they run in an industrial time, so that there's no room on board a ship for taking longer to do something. Everything is divided up into watches. There are bells that ring out the time. Everybody knows where they need to be, and so I think it's actually quite interesting that this whole animal needs to be drawn and dispatched in order for it to be ready for dinner. So that the drawing, if you like, is fitted into ship time. That was a beautiful drawing.
Isn't it lovely? Yeah. Well, we think that's a painting by Alexander Buchan. It's signed by Sidney Parkinson, but we think that's one of the paintings that Alexander Buchan did. So yes, the idea of Banks and Solander having to write on this precarious platform that they built. This is for someone using a camera lucida, but the stool is quite a good way of showing how you could possibly write as well. And actually, that's quite how Daniel Solander's slip calendar catalogue looks as well. It's these long sheets of paper like that. And there's similar things that you can do with a drawing board. So yeah, I think that's the best scenario I can come up with for how they would have been working and painting. I don't know if Chris has any comments on that.
It seems the most practical way. I mean, I guess space, you've got other people performing tasks on deck at the same time, and you can't get in their way, so you need to be in a space that's sort of isolated from the rest of the activity, using as minimal apparatus as possible, but also knowing that you got to be a certain distance away from the shark to be able to get it all within your vision, to be able to translate it onto a sheet of paper. So there's an amount of space that you need, but it'd be pretty tight.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking was that they only fish when the ship is still, I think, so either at anchor or they're becalmed. So there shouldn't be a lot of breeze when they're drawing. So Matt did a lot of work trying to work out if it is actually windy when you're on a ship, because you're going with the wind.
That's right. We had that discussion last time, didn't we?
But of course, the other thing is that, I mean, for anybody that's been on a ship with a rolling deck, if you're trying to do something like drawing, I mean, I know this from fishing, that if you get a tangle and you're looking at your reel, you will get seasick really fast. So yeah, well, I suppose somebody with really good sea legs might be able to do it, but I suspect a lot of these activities are going to happen when the amount of motion is minimal.
When as they were about to go around Cape Horn, Banks comments that the artists are able to draw through anything by then. Yeah, so this is the platform that they've added to it.
So that looks like a sun canopy.
Oh, I thought it was a balustrade. Oh, right.
So I think that what they've done there is that they've shaded the area.
Yes. Oh, so do you think this is actually the extension here, and this is a sun canopy?
It is possible that they've extended one of the decks, but that does look like it's a sun canopy to me.
Yeah.
Would that have been for the animals that were brought on board?
The sheep were underneath it. And then this presumably is for the people who are then on top of the platform.
Okay, so that sounds like it's more midships.
Yes. Yeah, I couldn't quite make sense of it. Yeah.
But that looks to me that though it's a sun canopy for people that are spending a lot of time out there, which would make total sense.
And where's the quarterdeck?
Oh God, I always get my my decks. So let me just have a quick look. So quarterdeck is at the back, and I think that's what you've got the screen over. But it would have been so you would normally have the animals, midships.
Oh, right.
And so it would have been possible to extend the quarterdeck over the midships.
Oh, I see. Right.
And that would make total sense. So effectively, it would give you more working space.
Yes. Yes, because on the replica, that rear part of the ship is taken up with this enormous rudder. Although I think that rudder is removable, or the arm of it is removable, but it's like 12 feet long.
Yes. So when you're going in here, the equipment for swinging the rudder backwards and forwards is enormous, and it takes up much of the space below decks here, even though that's where the great cabin is supposed to be.
Right.
And of course, this is the business end of the vessel where the wheel is as well.
Yes.
So that's, if you like, the quarterdeck proper. So I imagine it's going to be forward of all of that, that any scientific work is going to happen.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you look back on the image that you had, I mean, it seems to be that shading cloth was over quite a large part of that part of the vessel. And then if they're describing animals down below, it's midships.
Right. So it's actually forward, not actually directly beneath. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Oh, that makes a lot more sense. Yep. Well, I think that's all of my questions, but maybe the others have questions that they'd like to ask.
Maybe just a question about hierarchy on board and the likelihood of crew collaborating potentially with officers or the artists on board in terms of getting these drawings happening beyond preserving the specimens, but in terms of actually contributing to, say, colouring in areas of watercolours, for example.
The official hierarchy on board a vessel is really quite strict. So the kind of articulation point is the bosuns, who are very important. And so they're the ones that would impose discipline, that they would report anything that was untoward. They're likely to have recommended anybody from amongst the crew who was had skills in a particular area that they might utilize. But generally speaking, I think you should view what's going on as being two distinct channels. So there's the sailing of the vessel, which is Cook and his crew, and then there's the scientific endeavour, which is Banks and the hierarchy within that team. And I suspect, though I don't know for sure, that there isn't a lot of intersection between those two two levels of command.
So there does seem to be evidence of, but certainly the midshipmen assisting with drawing and so on. And I think the impression that we're getting of Sydney Parkinson's administration, well, he seems to have signed everything, but actually not, and has done an awful lot of paintings himself personally, but there's a lot more signed by him than he's actually done, is that in order to get through the amount of documentation that had to be done in those fractions of time that you're talking about, within the ship's watch and so on, that he just recruited anyone that he could find to help.
And certainly, yes, the midshipmen would be, that they operate in a kind of like strange space because they generally sleep with the crew. So they're not in the officer space, but they would dine in the wardroom,
right?
Generally speaking, so that they sort of move between the below decks and above decks, between two worlds.
This project, we looked at the first 9 weeks of the voyage, which is the voyage from England to Madeira. And when they arrived in Madeira, they spent 5 days there, and they were met by the English consul, Mr. Cheap, who took them to his quinta, which is like a mansion, and where they were able to work in far more luxurious circumstances. And we identified up to 5 assistants working with Sydney Parkinson in getting that documentation done.
Yeah, we did that largely based on the style of the works. You can see distinct differences between each of these artists' works, and you can identify them as even though some of them we didn't actually identify as people, but you can tell from the style that it's significantly different from the other artists.
Yeah, and then we took our theories to an expert in botanical illustration, Deirdre Bean.
I'll start from the beginning. So when I go into the field, I've already done my research, so I sort of know what I'm looking for. And I was working very closely with a botanical, like a scientist who was a mangrove expert in the world, Norm Duke. And if he was going up to the Daintree River, I'd make sure that I could go up there and be up there at the same time as him, because on his days off from the expedition, we would go looking for something that he wanted to look for. And that was always interesting to me, because it was usually, he was always looking for new species. So I've been on the sort of the cutting edge of finding new mangrove species in Australia with Norm experience. But on that river, I had three species of mangroves that I'd never seen before that I had to illustrate. So my method is, I find my plant, I take lots of photos, I take a specimen, I put it in a plastic bag with water in the bottom and tie a knot in it, and put it in a cool box. And then we had to drive 300 kilometres back to Darwin to a hotel room where I just went frantic. But the next, I only had 1 day before these things started to droop. So I had to get them out, and referring to my photos of how they actually grew, because when you put them in a plastic bag, you don't know how, so the habit is quite important. So I flew back to Brisbane where I was still working on them. So I didn't ever get a finished painting. But
and when you were working the Daintree, did you actually draw in the field?
Well, when I was doing the mangroves, I tended not to, for various reasons. Remember where I was? I was in the mangroves. I was in the mud. I was or on a boat. I had a very, very short time. I had all this stuff, and I could not sit there and draw because I would be covered in ants, and and it was hot, and I was dehydrated. And
so when you're handling all these specimens, how much kind of surface space do you need?
I use natural light, so I don't need a light but I'd have it there. I'd have my specimen on something sitting there, right there next to me. You'd have water, you'd have your palette, you'd have your page. You probably could do it with a meter. That's probably all I need.
Oh, so it is a fairly compact activity.
With watercolour, yeah.
Actually, I did want to ask you about the drawings in the articles you sent us. So that's the one. Yeah. What's happening? This use of tracing paper.
Yeah. Oh, that's how I actually work out my compositions. Because a lot of the time, like with the flowers, they flower at some time of the year, and then the next year they might not flower. And this is what happened with this one. But then I wanted the fruit, and the fruit don't come until after the flowers are finished, obviously. So I have to go back and draw that, and then I do the cross sections, and I have flowers and fruit, so that's separate, and then the habit of the tree. So what I've done is I've obviously done that coloured one, finished that, and on a separate piece of paper I've also painted that one, and on a separate piece of paper I've already finished that one too. So then I trace them. And then I work out where I want to put them.
And then do you have to reproduce them again on this page? So it's like double the work in a way.
Yeah. I might have done like a Sydney Parkinson and done half of it, the colour and the and then I can easily just fill in the gaps.
I was just a question I was thinking of, Deirdre. Let's say if we travelled back in time and Sydney Parkinson gave you one of his incomplete drawings, would you be able to confidently finish it without actually having the specimen, do you think?
Yeah, I probably could. Probably could.
And you'd know other botanical illustrators. Do you think that someone with less ability would be able to do the same kind of thing? Or?
I don't know. I think you have to know your species. I think you have to have some sort of knowledge on what you're doing, because some like especially mangroves anyway. Some of them have got, because they're from 20 different plant families. They've all got different coloured leaves, so you've got to sort of know your species.
Okay. Because one thing that I've always wondered about with Ferdinand Bauer and others, that kind of numbering system that's used, do you think it's for the benefit of the artist making the work, or is it instructional for other people to complete?
I've got a friend, Marion Westmacott. She did exactly that project. She was given an illustration of Ferdinand Bauer's with all the numbers on it of an extinct species. So she didn't actually have access to the plant. So she had to work out what colour she was used, what number was what colour.
Right.
Amazing. Wow.
This is an Endeavour drawing, and that one's yours. And I just thought, well, this is a perfect benchmark for how long it took to do.
Oh God, yeah. That took me a long time.
Did it? Yeah.
Because they don't last out of the fridge.
Yeah.
I do as much as I could, and I'd photograph a lot, and I'd do the drawing, and I'd measure everything and do like that, and then I might do that all day to get all the planning and all the drawing, all that right, take lots of photos, and then fillet it and eat it. And then I would freeze the rest of it and then just bring it out of the freezer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when I wanted to, work on it.
So when you say you fillet it and eat it and then you freeze the rest of it, what were you freezing? Were you just like freezing the top half or something?
Take the meat bit off that I want to eat and then freeze the skeleton and then the head.
I see.
Right. Bits, and then I just bring it out. Like that's all the information. That's a lot of information in there.
Yeah.
And
so how long did this one take?
Oh,
a while.
Probably a couple of weeks.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I can't work every day, so it would be, when I say I can't work all day every day, so I'd probably only spend like 4 hours a day, and I just get too tired. Of course, those ones where you're really concentrating really hard. It takes like going backwards and forwards, balancing up the colour, just make sure that everything's correct. Measuring, making sure that it's just a lot of It's concentrating. It's hard work. Yeah.
So if you were on board the Endeavour and you had a fresh fish come in that you had to paint within a day, that'd be a pretty intense and stressful situation, because there's no.
The thing I do is measure it, get the dimensions right, and then just get the colour, because that's the first thing that goes with the colour, with the fish, is the colour. That's a nice one too, isn't it?
Yeah, I was working on the idea that this was actually a collaboration. It's in a different style from the others, between Alexander Buchan, who seems to be a beautiful zoological painter, and Herman Spurring, who has this very kind of geometric style. So I think Spurring's done the scales. He's put in every single one.
I think he's been a little bit liberal with the scales.
Yeah.
Like the ones around the face, for instance, and the ones around the tail. He's done that from his imagination, because
He's just added.
Like that, they get smaller and smaller and smaller and they get paler and paler around the bottom. Around here, they're so small. Yeah. And around the face, there's hardly anything.
Yeah.
So I think what's happened with this one, it looks like it's been drawn and then it's been coloured in.
Yeah. That's the system we're thinking of.
Yeah.
I can show you examples of Buchan's work. So he did these beautiful insect drawings. So this is him. And this is my photograph. It's unpublished, but yes. So he's just exquisite.
He didn't pin them.
Sorry.
Like, for me, if I was going to be drawing those insects, I would have pinned them out so that I would have had their legs extended.
But actually, there's this other drawing. So I don't think he's an expert in zoology. There's this other drawing that Chris has reproduced. This is the first painting that was done on the ship. But you can see, Chris noticed this. Actually, I can go. Whoop, oh.
It's tiny, but it's an absolutely tiny thing.
You can see it a bit better here. So you can see these dark lines here. They're just thanks with his ink pen.
Wow. Yeah.
So I think Buchan, he was a beautiful painter, but he wasn't a scientific painter. He was a landscape artist first up. Right. Oh, this is his. Oh, these are beautiful. I think these are his.
Oh yeah, lovely.
Yep.
Big insects of some sort. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, they're nice, aren't they?
Yeah. Right. Yes. So Chris puts an estimate of 2 to 4 hours on this one, I think, or on Buchan's insect drawings.
2 to 4 hours.
Per creature. I don't know. This one would be a little bit longer. This one would be,
Yeah, I think you probably would be. Yeah, I think probably. Yeah.
If you've got confidence.
That's the same. So you could, almost a little bit different on the wing at the top there. Yeah, they must have, how did they do? They must have had a pen. Like, you know how they must have had a, if that's in ink, that looks like it's in some sort of, I don't think, they would have had to have very fine brushes. Look at the little, you've got the little, right down the bottom on the end of those little legs.
Yeah.
Got those little fine details. How big is that in real life? Do you know?
Oh, it's life size. So, very small.
So small.
So they're about a centimetre, I suppose. Yeah.
Very fine tips on their brushes. Gee, that's
Do you think would they have used pencil first, Deirdre, to outline these, do you think, or have they just gone straight into watercolour?
Oh, I think they've probably gone straight into watercolour. They look probably, because that's another time-consuming thing. That's probably why it's done 4 on one page, because you can get you just move from one to the other and to the other and do them fairly fast.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
that's a bit of an ability though to be able to do something like this without any pencil drafting.
You can do it though. You can. These guys are really competent drawers.
Yeah.
Well, there's a mixture of them. Yeah. Some of them are and some of them aren't. This one is one of the Buchan drawings, but I think this might be
Parkinson or someone else. It's not as good to my eye.
You're harsh.
Yeah, I reckon it's pretty good.
Do you?
It looks, yeah.
I think when you look at, it doesn't have that photographic quality that his other ones have. It looks more sketch, but maybe.
It looks, I mean, it kind of has a lot of similarities to the Aniscus in terms of, in terms of colouring and some of the definition of the things. And it's a bit larger, this one, isn't it? I mean, this is
it is.
This one on the left-hand side has got the underside of the bug, whatever it is, a cockroach or something.
Yeah, it's a cockroach,
See how there's a fair bit of work that's gone into all that detail in that underside and those little hairs on his legs. They've all folded up. You know, measuring them and getting them the right proportions. There's a fair bit of technical skill in that.
Yeah.
And just getting those antennae the right length and just the same on both sides. Not easy.
Oh, right.
Who signed this one, Harriet?
I think it's unsigned.
Okay.
I think it's one of the ones that is in Solander's slip catalogue with the name Buchan against it.
Okay.
With the note that it was found in the kitchen, in the Madeira kitchens, in Latin.
Yeah.
There's a few in this style in Madeira, and then more when they get to Rio, and then the styles kind of merge and they become very difficult to distinguish. But they've just got this they're kind of harder. The light is kind of shinier, and it's just, whereas Parkinson's drawings tend to have a much kind of softer feel to them.
They used gouache. That looks like a gouache drawing. Gouache rather than just watercolor.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it looks fairly opaque, doesn't it? And then
that's why it's got that milky appearance.
Yeah.
You think this one, they're both gouache?
This one looks like
I think that,
but the other one's probably a watercolor.
But sometimes they use the highlights, like to use the Venetian or whatever they might use a bit of gouache. Look, you know what? That's gouache as well. That's got gouache. You can see it up here. See, the highlights, when you work with just purely watercolor, the highlights are the paper. So you can see how that's drawn over the top, the veins, and that light, that highlight on the underneath of that leaf, that's gouache as well.
Right.
And you can work a lot faster with gouache. You can get a result much faster. So I don't work with gouache. But I think if these guys were trying to work as fast as they could, they wouldn't be bothering with layering. They'd be bothering with putting one layer down and then moving on.
Yeah, this one we think has been using the technique you're talking about, where they've created the white by allowing the paper to show through. It's hard to tell though. It's not as good a photograph as the others.
Yeah, this doesn't look like to me that it's made by the same hand. It certainly hasn't got the same pigments, and it's sort of, they've taken more time with that the flower head. Is it signed? Or is it?
Yes, hang on. Parkinson has signed this, but it's not his. I'm certain that it's not his. So I think that this is an artist who's been brought in to assist, and it's been done in those 5 days from a specimen that they collected, because it's not in flower.
Fresh. See how the leaves are all standing up? Right.
And these are the ones that we're fairly certain are all Parkinson's own drawings. Right. So if we look at this, does the schedule of 2.5 days from start to finish sound at all likely to you?
How many illustrations?
Let me have a look. I think there's about 8 there.
So 2.5 days per drawing.
Yep.
Could I have a look at that Eugenia Jambos, please?
This one.
Yeah. You know what? I think how many days?
2.5. So I've given half a day to sketch in Madeira, half a day to part colour, and then 1 day on the ship to finish it. Oh no, so 1.5 days on the ship to finish it.
Yeah, I think so. Because they're not very, I mean, they're competently drawn, obviously, but they're not, there's just one layer and he's put then when that's dried. So gouache dries very quickly.
Yep.
You can put the white bit over the top and they're very, that would take like, I don't know, less than a minute.
Oh, right.
Do that white bit, like that would just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That wouldn't take very long at all. And if you've got a process going, if you've got, you know, the little drawing, that would take probably, I don't know.
This one here.
Yeah, probably, you got to, probably, I don't know, 2 minutes. Really?
Yeah.
When when you're as competent as he is, you would be able to do those drawings fairly quickly, like with his measuring and stuff like that. And because you want to work fast, to see that's already drooped, that leaf there on the left.
Oh, yes. Side. Oh, here, right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so you've got to, the fruit will stay because they're drooped as well. Yeah, so I think probably if he's doing the drawing and the partially coloured thing and then finishing on the ship, yes, I think he could have done it.
So what have we learnt about Alexander Buchan?
Well, I think we've learned as much about practice-led research as Alexander Buchan. I mean, we found out the volume of work that was made during that period required a level of
they had to be very ingenious
and organised. There had to be levels of collaboration between these different artists.
And Parkinson has this reputation as being a prolific artist, which he still was, but he's also an incredible administrator.
Oh yeah, yep. Signing off where necessary on others' works, whether they were better or worse.
And recruiting assistants as well, and from all sorts of sources, you know, local artists as well as from bank servants, and possibly the midshipmen on the Endeavour.
Yeah, establishing who in the process would be best, for example, at doing outlines. Who could quickly spread some gouache on the other side of leaves.
Yeah, who could be trained up, who had what skills they had already, and so on.
And who at the end of the process needed to say, this is a scientifically accurate representation of the specimen and could sign off on it.
Yes. And there's also an element of apprenticeship in it as well, where you know, you can see that in Buchan's work, where Banks is correcting his painting, and that's part of the process of developing this partnership between the naturalist and his long-standing artist. Who, unfortunately, Buchan died early on, but he could well have been. Banks might have had a famous collection of zoological drawings as well as botanical drawings, if Buchan had survived. The complete collection, pictorial record of the Endeavour's voyage was catalogued by Bernard Smith and Rudiger Jopian for the Australian Bicentennial Authority, and that's nearly 40 years ago now. It really needs to be updated, so those identifications that are based on the signatures are one dimension of the production of these drawings, but we need to add to that all the collaborative contributors to that record. The implications of this for art history are that they really change how we think about the production of art. So it's, in terms of the artist's identity, and it creates new there are a lot. We've shown there's a lot of new biographies to be written about the artists on the Endeavour. One of them is Thomas Richmond, who was one of Banks' servants and a black man, an important horticulturalist. This is a part of history that has kind of been left out because that word servant makes us assume domestic servant rather than employee. Whereas in fact he was clearly a very skilled horticulturalist and possibly one of the artists on the ship. Another really important artist on the Endeavour is, of course, Tupaia, who was the Ra'atan who joined the Endeavour in Tahiti and in order to travel to England, but unfortunately died in Batavia. And his sketchbook Tupai's sketchbook was incorrectly attributed to Joseph Banks until 1997. And the effects of this on the Pacific history, then, if you attribute the work of a First Nations artist to a colonialist, I mean, they simply transformed the whole narrative.